Saturday, September 28th, 2019, Maneco 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. This morning I want to talk about inflation, wealth inequality, the definition of inflation. Before I start though, I'll give you a bit of my background growing up in Brazil. Some of you might not know, you might be new to the channel. I was born in Brazil in the mid-60s, grew up in the 70s and 80s. Brazil, for many of you who don't know, has been called like a mixture of Belgium and India. So what does that mean? Well, it means that at the same time it's a very wealthy Europeanized country, but at the same time very poor with a lot of poverty, right? Both at the same time. And you can see the visual, how can I say, proof of that when you look at photos of big cities like Sao Paulo or Rio, where I grew up, where you see the beautiful beaches, big high-rises by the beach in Rio, and then behind the high-rises you see the favelas or the shanty towns. So I grew up with that. Luckily, I was not in the shanty town side of things, but I could see, and I knew there was something wrong. At the time, I didn't really put two and two together. I was still very young. That one of the major causes of the inequality was inflation. And you look at Brazil, since I've been born, I think we've had 4 different currencies. So inflation has been rampant in Brazil. The reason why I want to talk about inflation and inequality today is because I saw an article this morning in the FT, in the weekend edition. And that's the other reason why I read the FT, even though I don't agree with everything the FT says. You can see what the globalists are thinking. And this article is entitled, it's in the FT magazine, it says, "Now's the time to spread the wealth," says Thomas Piketty. Well, who is Thomas Piketty? Well, he's a very popular Keynesian economist that's come out in the last few years. He wrote a best-selling book. It says here, Piketty is the author of best-selling book, Capital in the 21st Century, which emphasizes the themes of his work on wealth concentrations and distributions over the past 250 years, right? So the FT now, Simon Cupper, he's come out with this article because Piketty has a new book, which still hasn't been published in English. But Simon Cupper lives in Paris, and I guess he reads French, and he's gone through the book, and he talks about it. Before I go into the article and give you my opinion about what I think about wealth inequality, inflation, and what should really be done, I want to talk about the definition of inflation. And I've made quite a few videos about this in the past, for those of you who are new subscribers and new viewers. So I start out by looking at an old dictionary that I have here from the 70s. It was my dad's and it's mine now. It's the Merriam-Webster dictionary, right? It's pretty old. I don't even have the back cover anymore. I've got some sellotape or scotch tape here holding the front cover. So it's an old dictionary, and I've gone to the definition of inflation here. So this is from the 70s, right? It says, an abnormal increase in the volume of money and credit resulting in a substantial and continuing rise in the general price level. So that's how they used to define it. That's how it really is. Inflation is an abnormal increase in the supply of money and credit, resulting in rising prices. So nowadays that's been turned on its head, the definition of inflation. So if we go here to the website Lexico, which is powered by Oxford definition of inflation, it says a general increase in prices and fall in the purchasing value of money. So notice that they've taken out the reason behind the increase in prices, right? They're defining now the effect of inflation. They're not really defining inflation, and that's the Oxford English Dictionary, right? So they've twisted it around, and why have they done that? Well, I think it's part of the, how can I say, the program to inflate the system with the economic academia, with academia in general, to change the definition of inflation. So what they've done, the central banks and economists, they've basically changed the definition by saying that the rising prices now are the inflation, so that people don't put the spotlight in the massive amount of debt. And debt nowadays, we know in a fiat currency system, is the money, right? The massive increase in debt and credit is the same thing, debt and credit, right? And so how do they keep consumer prices from rising? Well, they haven't really, because we all know, the general public, that that's total humbug, as Boris Johnson said the other day. It's total humbug. We know the cost of living is rising. We know that there is wealth inequality has become more pronounced because of that, because the very wealthy can always protect themselves against inflation. From firsthand experience, I know that in a place where there's rampant inflation, like in Brazil, where I was growing up, it's very hard for the general public to keep up with inflation. People who are better off, they usually are involved in a business that, how can I say, has foreign earnings, in that case dollars in Brazil. So people who had access to dollars were fine, because yes, they eventually had to change their dollars to their local currency in Brazil. But if they earned enough dollars, they could keep a surplus and saving dollars, and they would be okay. But for the general public, it's very hard. Someone who has a low-paying job, or the general public who are not involved in foreign commerce or trade, who are involved in the local economy, it gets very hard for them. And that's why you see the wealth disparity that you see in countries like Brazil, and we're starting to see it in Western Europe as well, and in the US. The general public is not able to protect itself because the inflation robs the power, purchasing power of their earnings, and they don't have the wherewithal to protect themselves. So how have they basically conned people into believing that actually a lot of the central banks now say that inflation, low inflation, is a problem, that inflation has to be high? Well, they've basically tinkered the statistics, and I recommend for that you go to shadowstats.com. John Williams explains really well how the current measures of CPI, which they call inflation, which is like basically is not right, because CPI is a measure of prices. Inflation, of course, is the rise in the money supply and credit, and we know that that's been ballooning since the '08 crisis, right? So, but they've still had to tinker with the CPI, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, not only in the US, but everywhere around the Western world. CPI, or whatever it's called in your country, has been tinkered with. So what John Williams has done, he's gone back and he calculates, for example, CPI as they used to calculate it in 1980. So you can see here that it's almost 10% if you calculate it like it was calculated in 1980. If you calculate it like they calculated in 1990, it's just under 6%. So that's why the general public is feeling the pinch, even though we've been told by our economic masters, our politicians, our bankers, economists, that the problem is low inflation. So there you go. That's the inflation tax. And I argue that that's the worst kind of tax. It hurts more the general public. It makes things even more unequal. And that's why the inequality is increasing in the UK, Western Europe, in the US. And it's becoming more and more like Brazil, a third world country. Right? What else does this cheating on the CPI do? Well, it helps the government, the welfare state, to screw basically the general public because they index the increase in the cost of living. They underestimate it, so people's wages don't go up as much. People's pensions don't go up as much, right? Instead of going up by 10 or 6%, they're going up by 1 or 2. So that's the other part of the inequality. And why am I talking about this before going into this FT article? Well, because from what I've read about Piketty and from what I'm reading now, he never mentions the monetary system, the fact that we are under a fiat currency monetary system. We've been in one since the early 70s. And in my opinion, that's one of the reasons, the biggest reasons why wealth inequality has become much more pronounced. And I have to say, I don't think there will always be a perfect system where everyone has the same wealth, of course. There is the old Pareto rule, of course, that 20% of the population own 80% of the wealth. Am I saying that is right? No, but that's the way things are. I think there will always be people who are not as well off as others. And I don't think we can change that. But what we can help change is the disparity, I think, through the monetary system. The other thing that having a sound money system does, and that would be gold, 100% gold backing, and also silver for the like a bimetallic system. That would stop governments and banks from creating the inflation. That would make inflation impossible. I guess you could have localized inflation if you found gold. There's a gold rush in an area like in California in 1849. There was inflation, of course, in the local area, but that didn't last very long. And that's why gold is a good form of money, because there's so much gold that's been mined over history that an increase in the supply doesn't make much difference for too long. There you go. That's the way I feel about it. Let's now go to this FT article and see what Simon Cupper is saying about Piketty's new book, right? So it's entitled, "Now's the Time to Spread the Wealth," says Thomas Piketty. His premise is that inequality is a choice societies make, not an inevitability. Let's go through Simon Cupper's article and what he thinks about Thomas Piketty's new book. So he says Thomas Piketty's new book, Capital and Ideology, appears in English translation next March, but I got a sneak preview by walking into my local Parisian bookshop and handing over 25 euros for the French edition. My conclusion: the 1,200-page tome might become even more politically influential than the French economist's 2013 overview of inequality, Capital in the 21st Century. Helped a little by that book, inequality has soared up the left's agenda, especially in the particularly unequal US and UK. Now Elizabeth Warren has a shot at becoming the most redistributionist US president since Franklin D. Roosevelt, while an elaborate post-Corbyn Labour leader could achieve similar in Britain. So Piketty explains why this could be the moment for a turn to equality and which policies could make that happen. So you will see he never mentions inflation, right? Because I don't know if he's part of the program or if he's just ignorant to know what inflation is, but I don't think so. So I think he's more part of the program. and I don't think his ideas are going to help, but let's go through it. It's my opinion. So I continue. His premise is that inequality is a political choice. It's something societies opt for, not an inevitable result of technology and globalization. Whereas Marx saw history as class struggle, Piketty sees it as a battle of ideologies. Not sure what that means, the difference there. Every unequal society, he says, creates an ideology to justify inequality. That allows the rich to fall asleep in their houses while the homeless freeze outside. Well, I would say something about that. I think the crisis of '08 is one of the biggest reasons why this is happening, this inequality in the US, the UK, even in Western Europe. I mean, it's not just the US and the UK. With the collapse of the banks, Wall Street, City of London, those are the people. Those are the people at the top, right? The very wealthy, and they control the big corporations. So, in my opinion, it's the fault of the central banks and the politicians that did not allow those bad actors to fail, right? And collapse and become bankrupt, right? They saved them with your money, with the general public's money. He never talks about that. All the debt that's been incurred was to save the system, because we know that nowadays is money, right? But never talks about that. The other thing it did, it spoiled them, basically. It gave them, oh, go ahead, keep doing what you're doing, make your billions, and we'll have your back, right? So he never talks about that. And you couldn't have had that in a system where you don't have central banks, where you have sound money, like gold and silver, right? Where banks, if they act irresponsibly, they fail, right? Never talks about the monetary system. So that's my gripe about this. I continue though. In his overambitious history of inequality from ancient India to today's US, Piketty recounts the justifications that recur throughout time. So this is what Piketty says. Rich people deserve their wealth. It will trickle down. They give it back through philanthropy. Property is liberty. The poor are undeserving. Once you start redistributing wealth, you won't know where to stop and there will be chaos. A favorite argument after the French Revolution, communism failed. The money will go to black people, an argument that Piketty says explains why inequality remains highest in countries with historic racial divides such as Brazil, South Africa, and the US. Not too sure about that, but anyway, I think Brazil is more because of the inflation. Yes, maybe racism or racial divides has impacted things in Brazil, but let's continue. Another common justification, which he doesn't mention, is high taxes are punitive, as if the main issue were the supposed psychology behind redistribution rather than its actual effects. All these justifications add up to what he calls sacralization of property. But today he writes, the proprietarist and meritocratic narrative is getting fragile. There's a growing understanding that so-called meritocracy has been captured by the rich, who get their kids into top universities, buy political parties, and hide their money from taxation. Moreover, notes Piketty, the wealthy are overwhelmingly male and their lifestyles tend to be particularly environmentally damaging. So he's even getting the environment into this. Donald Trump, a climate change denying sexist heir who got elected president without releasing his tax returns, embodies the problem. I think that's, anyway, that seems a bit, how can I say, to say that Donald Trump, just because he's wealthy, that he's worse for the environment. I'm not sure. I worked that one out. In fact, support for redistribution is growing even faster than Piketty acknowledges, especially in the US. Twice as many Americans now feel more distrust than admiration for billionaires. According to a Huffington Post YouGov poll, millennials are especially suspicious of success. Well, the other thing I would say, though, if the U.S. hadn't gone off the gold standard in 1971 and we hadn't had all this massive inflation, I don't think there would be as many billionaires as there is now, right? More American adults under 30 say they believe in socialism than capitalism. Well, I don't think we have really free market, small government capitalism, right? This generation owns too little property to sacralize it. Center-right parties across the West have taken up populism because their low-tax, small state story wasn't selling anymore. Well, it's not selling because governments are still very big in the West. I mean, look at France. Government spending is 56% of GDP. Look at the Euro area, almost 50%, 46.8%. The UK is lower, 38.5%, and the US is 38%, but it's still big government. It's still more than a third of the government. So that argument doesn't really, how can I say, make sense to me, right? Right-wing populism speaks to today's anti-elitists, anti-meritocratic mood. Well, I think the right-wing populism he talks about is just people knowing that there was something wrong that happened in '08, that a few thousand people got bailed out, right, by the millions and millions of people all around the world that have to carry that debt. And the inflation, of course, because that's what it is. However, it deliberately refocuses debate from property to what Piketty calls the frontiers. That leaves a gap in the political market for redistributionist ideas. We're now at a juncture much like around 1900 when extreme inequality helped launch social democratic and communist parties. Piketty lays out a new redistribution agenda. He calls for educational justice, essentially spending the same amount of money on each person's education. He favors giving workers a major say over how their companies are run, as in Germany and Sweden, but his main proposal is for wealth taxes. This is the part that gets interesting here. So let's keep going. Far from abolishing property, he wants to spread it to the bottom half of the population, who even in rich countries have never owned much. To do this, he says, requires redefining private property as temporary and limited. You can enjoy it during your lifetime in moderate quantities. So I have a problem with that. And I'm not saying the system we've got now is perfect. And I've told you why, because of the inflation. But what incentive does that give you to work all your life for yourself and your family if it's not going to be there after you die, right? There's not going to be incentive. That's the first problem. But I think a lot of these people don't think about this because they haven't read the Austrian school. They haven't read about human action, how people think, right? They just think, oh, let's do this and it should be fine. They don't think of the consequences. The Keynesian economists like Piketty. He proposes wealth tax. This is the funny part. At least I thought it was funny. He proposes wealth tax of 90% on billionaires. From the proceeds, a country such as France could give each citizen, listen to this, a trust fund worth about 120,000 euros or about $135,000 at age 25. Very high tax rates, he notes, didn't impede fast growth in the 1950 to 1980 period. So let's stop here for a moment. So socialists or redistributionists or collectivists like Piketty, they usually say, oh, it's unfair that the wealthy, they spoil their children with their trust funds. But he's proposing the same thing. Not from your parents, but from the state. A trust fund for 25-year-olds. I continue here. We're almost finished now. Warren, that's I guess Elizabeth Warren, advised by economists who work with Piketty, is proposing annual taxes of 2% on household fortunes over 50 million and 3% on billionaires. She projects this would affect 75,000 households and yield revenues of $2.75 trillion over 10 years. Post suggests most Americans like the idea. Yeah, of course they would. But again, what are the consequences? Well, the very wealthy, they always find ways around such draconian rules or taxes, right? What else does it do? What's the other consequence? Well, it doesn't incentivize people to be entrepreneurial, to try to build a business, right? It doesn't. Paradoxically, the plutocratic U.S. may be ideal terrain for a wealth tax. Marc Stabile, economist at INSEAD, well, INSEAD is a business school in Paris, points out that first, rich Americans now have so much wealth that even if Warren captures just a small proportion, it could add up to a lot. Well, I'll stop there a second because he has a second point to make. I think a lot of this wealth is just on paper anyway. When the system implodes, which a lot of you probably know that I think it will because it's unsustainable, a lot of that wealth will disappear anyway, right? So Mr. Stabile, look a little bit closer at what this real wealth is, right? Second, he says, Americans are taxed on their passports, so moving wealth abroad won't save them. And Warren would slap hefty exit taxes on anyone giving up citizenship. Last, thanks to Swiss leaks and the Panama Papers, we've learned a lot about how the rich hide money. You'll find another way, I think, Mr. Stabile. Advocates of inequality will come up with the usual justifications. But now is the redistributionists' best chance. I certainly don't advocate inequality, but I also don't advocate redistribution because I don't think that's the way forward. So he's taken me out of the debate there. What I advocate is a fairer monetary system that keeps government in check, that keeps workers, earnings safe from inflation, right? Which we have tons of these days. But I haven't seen anyone look at that, at least not in the mainstream. So there you go. In my opinion, redistribution, taxation is not the way forward. In my opinion, the only way to create wealth and prosperity for all is to actually protect wealth and prosperity from government, because that's the whole problem. So people like Piketty are encouraging even more government intervention, and the consequences are going to be even worse, in my opinion. What we need to do is reform the banking system, abolish central banks, not allow a few dozen people to control the money supply. As Mayor Amschel Rothschild said almost 200 years ago, give me control of the money supply and I care not who makes the rules. So those are the people in charge, Mr. Piketty. Those are the people we have to go after. Let the people control their own money and have the money that is best. And people, believe me, Mr. Piketty, are clever enough to know what money is best, and they usually decide on precious metals. They don't decide on a piece of paper, a worthless piece of paper. So that's what I would say. Will that make the world perfectly equal? My idea is no. There will always be those who have more than others, but I think it will, decrease the disparity. And that's my opinion. Let me know what you think. Comment below in the comment section, and I'll try to reply to as many of you as I can. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit the like button. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, think about subscribing. And you can also follow me on Twitter, Steemit, and on DTube. I wish you all a great weekend. Take care. Bye.